I worked as a hospital transporter for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement where all the laundry was done and supplies were sorted. After one particular incident, I dreaded working late nights. I was alone in the basement one evening when I heard whistling near the elevator at the end of the hallway. Expecting to see my coworker on duty, I poked my head around the corner, but no one was there. I shrugged it off as I'm not easily spooked. With the night being slow, I had some snacks and relaxed in the break room for a while. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang. When I went into the hallway, I saw a bed rolling down and bumping into the sides. I radioed my coworker thinking he was just playing a prank, but he replied that he was upstairs in the cafeteria. I was still skeptical, so I thought I'd catch him in the act. As I walked past the laundry room, the machine started running. Expecting to find him there, I popped my head in, but it was completely empty. Now I started to get a little nervous. I stepped into the laundry room and the machines stopped abruptly. I froze, then bolted out and headed toward the elevator when I heard the whistling again. I was certain I was the only worker in the basement. While waiting for the elevator, I watched in disbelief as things began falling off the shelves down the hall. The boxes of gloves, tissues, and packages of tubes were all falling one by one at the opposite end. My entire body broke out in goosebumps, my hairs stood on end, and I had a strong gut feeling I was being watched. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt what seemed like someone brushing my arm. I rushed upstairs and found my coworker in the cafeteria, where I freaked out to him about what had happened. I left that place and transferred soon after. The eeriest part of it all is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It's almost as if whatever that was mimicking me. It was the creepiest feeling ever. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Jameson Clark. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he wouldn't or couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then. There's just this notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall, which is definitely above average. He'd been raised in the rural Midwest and joined the military when he was 19. He was stationed somewhere in the West after boot camp, and he just inexplicably vanished one night. It was declared an AWOL for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Northeast. He approached the desk and said to the receptionist, "My name is Jameson Clark, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him via fingerprints, I guess. He was well-fed and in good health except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whoever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a ghost and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again. Jameson paced all day, every day, not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, although not even a breath could be heard. If he's told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing and never indicating hunger. When offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, like almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Jameson would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. Eventually, I got a better job somewhere else and I resigned. On my last day there, the last thing I saw was Jameson, who was pacing in the parking lot. He was throwing his head back to laugh without a sound. I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. During med school, we had an anatomy exam scheduled for November 1st. On Halloween night, my roommate and I decided to use the fact that everyone else was out celebrating to get some quiet study time. The basement of the med school, where we were studying surrounded by cadavers, was already pretty unsettling. About an hour into our study session, as we were deeply immersed in our anatomy review, we suddenly heard a faucet turn on from the far end of the lab. These faucets are motion activated, and we were on the complete opposite side of the room. We exchanged uneasy glances but tried to brush it off and continued studying. Soon after, the faucet on the other side of the room turned on again. This happened a few more times over the next hour, each time from a different location in the lab. Feeling increasingly unnerved, we decided it was time to leave. As we gathered our belongings, we noticed a side room where instructors usually prepare their lectures and exams. Curious, we decided to peek inside. To our shock, we saw someone we didn't recognize, hunched over a cadaver with their back to the door. Despite our noisy entrance, this person remained focused on their work. We were both spooked, especially since we hadn't heard anyone come in. Without another word, we quietly backed out and hurriedly left the lab. During my training years as a psychiatrist, I spent 6 months working in a ward dedicated to treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. The ward was housed in an old building that had been serving psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. Our floor had 13 beds, a nurse's station, a living room, and a few conference rooms. A few weeks into my stint, I was interviewing a patient who mentioned that she heard a baby crying at night which disturbed her sleep. Given that our hospital was isolated from residential areas and had strict visiting hours, there were no babies around. After the interview, a nurse pulled me aside and seriously mentioned that the baby crying wasn't a psychotic symptom. She didn't elaborate and I didn't press further. It didn't affect the patient's diagnosis or treatment, so I soon forgot about it. About 3 months into my time there, I was sitting at the nurse's station while 3 nurses behind me chatted. One remarked that she's very active today, and another replied that they hadn't really noticed. I'd asked whom they were talking about. They exchanged glances, and one hesitantly told me, "Well, there's a baby here. She cries sometimes." I was skeptical, but before I could respond, I heard it. There's a distant yet clear baby's cry, as if it were coming from behind 2 or 3 walls. I was perplexed as I looked at the nurses, who gave me a knowing look. I questioned them further, but they had no more information. They just confirmed that this faint baby cry had always been there. I heard it 2 or 3 times a week over the next few months. I mentioned it to a new doctor who laughed it off, but a few weeks later, she came to me. She was looking pale and admitted she heard it during her coffee break. All the nurses seemed aware of it, but in psychiatry, hearing such things isn't something to boast about. When I was transferred, I never heard the crying again. I think about it sometimes, but I still don't know what to make of it. I'm part of an on-call crisis response team, so I often find myself at the hospital during odd hours. This particular time, it was around 4 in the morning. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, trying to gather my thoughts and jot down notes for my report when I noticed something in my peripheral vision. I distinctly saw the blue of a hospital gown, but when I turned to look, no one was there. I chalked it up to being tired and went back to my notes. After a few minutes, I caught another glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. This time, I saw someone when I looked up. Standing on the curb in front of the hospital was a man in his mid to late 50s. He was wearing a hospital gown and holding onto something metal that looked like a crutch. He wasn't leaning on it. His expression was one of wide-eyed shock, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. I started looking around for hospital staff because this man didn't seem like he should be outside alone. His skin was an unsettling pale color, and he was barefoot. The shadows obscured his feet, but his hands and fingers looked bruised. As I was scanning the area for help, our eyes met. I felt a chill run through me, but I got out of my car to help guide him back inside. When I looked up again, he was gone. I searched the parking lot thoroughly, but he was nowhere to be found. There's no way he could have disappeared so quickly in the mere seconds it took me to open my car door. I don't know how to describe it without sounding dramatic, but my skin crawled when he looked at me. He had the look of someone who was slowly realizing he had just passed away and didn't know what to do next. I still think about it sometimes. There's probably some medical explanation for this, but it's still the strangest thing I've witnessed as a nurse so far. We had a very strong-willed but confused elderly lady on our floor. Her room was right in front of the nurse's station, so we could keep a close watch on her. And she also had one of our nurse aides as a sitter. She was always struggling, kicking, and trying to get out of bed. She's very restless and agitated, like some patients I've had before who were near the end. One day, we were called into her room as her heart rate started to drop. She lay there very still with her eyes open. The heart rate plummeted down to 30, then 20, and then it flatlined. We checked for a pulse and found none. She had a do not resuscitate order, so we did not attempt to bring her back. We closed her eyes and called her family as we prepared to get the body bag. The sitter stayed in the room to begin preparing the body. Less than 10 minutes later, she called us back in. The elderly lady was at it again, hitting, kicking, and trying to get out of bed. She came back to life on her own. Honestly, we found the situation amusing, and I've never seen any patient come back on their own like that. Even more surprising is she eventually made it out of the hospital too. I was a fresh intern in a sprawling university hospital. Like many hospitals in the UK, part of it is cutting edge, while another part hasn't seen a coat of paint since the 1970s. Much of the older section has been in use for years, but late at night, interns would navigate these closed wards and corridors as shortcuts when under pressure. My cardiac arrest alarm went off around 3 a.m. In case you're wondering, this alarm is called a code in America. I was on the ground floor of the old section, and the call was at the far end of the top floor of the same area. I dashed up 5 flights of stairs to reach the correct floor, but ended up on the wrong side. I had to pass through a vast abandoned ward that was completely pitch black to get to the ward I needed. As I sprinted down a long dark corridor, huffing and puffing, I nearly collided with an elderly woman. She grabbed my arm, and I'll never forget how ice-cold her grip was. She asked me where is the way out in a calm voice. I pointed back toward where I had just come from and told her to take the elevators. I continued my sprint. I was the first doctor to arrive at the bedside, where a nurse was performing CPR. Another was preparing adrenaline. I went to the head of the bed to manage the airway. When I looked down, I kid you not, it was the same elderly woman I had met in the corridor. Please drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more horror stories.